there is a moment that genealogists learn to dread. You're tracing a family backward through time, through census records, through marriage certificates, through the careful handwriting of county clerks who recorded births in ledgers that smelled of ink and damp wood. You move through 1900, then 1890, and then you arrive at 1870, and the trail simply stops. Not fades, not grows uncertain. Stops. For millions of Americans, Black Americans especially, but also poor white Southerners, immigrants whose names were mangled at processing stations, indigenous families swept into the machinery of assimilation, the year 1870 functions less like a date and more like a wall, a hard, deliberate edge where the past refuses to speak. For a long time, people assumed this was simply how history worked. Records deteriorated. Fires happened. The Civil War was destructive. These explanations are not wrong exactly, but they are incomplete. And the incompleteness, it turns out, is its own kind of story. To understand why so many American family histories begin after 1870, you have to understand what 1870 actually was. It was the year of the first complete post-war census. The first federal count that legally required the recording of every person's name, not just the name of a white male head of household, with everyone else reduced to a tick mark, an age bracket, a number in a column. For the first time in the nation's history, formerly enslaved people were counted as individuals. They were given names in official documents. They were asked where they lived, what they did, how old they were. For roughly 4 million people emancipated 5 years earlier, this was, in a very precise sense, the moment of their official entry into the documentary record of the United States. Before 1870, for most of them, there was almost nothing. Not because they didn't exist, not because their lives lacked meaning or complexity or love or struggle, but because the system that governed their existence, the institution of slavery, had no interest in recording them as human beings. They were property, and property in the ledgers that mattered to the state was listed differently. The records that did exist for enslaved people were records of ownership, bills of sale, estate inventories, insurance documents, plantation logs that noted a boy about 14 strong or a woman childbearing age with infant. These were not records of people, they were records of assets. And when those assets were freed, the documents that might have traced their humanity backward through time belonged to other people. People who, in many cases, had every reason to let those documents disappear. Consider what happened in the American South in the years immediately following the Civil War. Plantations burned, some by retreating Confederate soldiers, some by Union troops, some by the enslaved people themselves, in acts of liberation and destruction that history has not always been comfortable naming clearly. County courthouses, which held deed records and estate papers and the wills that sometimes mentioned enslaved people by name, were caught in the crossfire of a war, and then the slow administrative chaos of Reconstruction. Some of the destruction was accidental, some of it was not. There is a courthouse in Columbia, South Carolina, whose records were lost when Sherman's army moved through in February of 1865. Researchers have spent decades trying to reconstruct what was there. In some counties across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, the antebellum record books simply end mid-sentence, the clerk's pen trailing off into a fire that history has never fully explained. But here is what rarely gets discussed in the same breath. In the years after the war, as formerly enslaved people began filing claims, seeking land, trying to prove relationships and residency and the names of their children, they repeatedly encountered a bureaucratic silence that was not entirely passive. Records that might have helped them establish legal standing had a way of becoming unavailable. Courthouses that held evidence of their family connections were, in some cases, destroyed after the war, not during it. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern that archivists and historians have documented with quiet persistence for decades. The historian Herbert Gutman noted it. Scholars working with the Freedmen Bureau records, the closest thing to a federal archive of formerly enslaved people's lives, have mapped the gaps. And the gaps cluster in suspicious ways. They cluster around counties with active land disputes. They cluster around the years of Reconstruction's collapse when the political will to protect black citizenship was being systematically dismantled. The Freedmen's Bureau deserves a moment of its own here. because it is one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking archives in American history. Established in 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was tasked with an almost impossible mandate to manage the transition of 4 million people from bondage to citizenship in a country that had no infrastructure, no precedent, and no genuine political consensus for doing so. Bureau agents recorded marriages, because enslaved marriages had had no legal standing, and families now wanted that standing formalized. They recorded labor contracts. They recorded complaints of violence, of wage theft, of re-enslavement by other names. And they recorded something else, something that researchers still find stunning when they encounter it for the first time. Letters. Tens of thousands of letters from formerly enslaved people trying to find family members who had been sold away. A woman in Virginia writing to ask if anyone knew the whereabouts of her daughter, sold to a Georgia planter in 1852. A man in Tennessee listing the names of his 6 children, their approximate ages, the name of the man who had owned them, asking quietly, formally, with a dignity that breaks something in the chest, if anyone had seen them. Many of these letters were never answered. The Bureau was defunded in 1872. Its records were scattered across federal archives, partially indexed, partially lost, largely unknown to the general public for over a century. When researchers began digitizing them in the early 2000s, they found something that no one had quite anticipated. A record of grief so vast and so specific that it reframed what it meant to talk about family separation in the antebellum South. These were not abstract statistics. These were names, dates, physical descriptions. The name of a child's favorite song included in a letter because a mother thought it might help someone recognize her daughter. And almost none of these searches succeeded. The records that would have helped were gone. There is a family in Baltimore. I'll call them the Holloways, because the real name belongs to living people who deserve their privacy, whose history a genealogist named Sandra Holloway spent 11 years trying to trace. Her great-great-grandmother appeared in the 1870 census as a woman named Celia, age approximately 35, living in a freedmen settlement in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. She listed no birthplace, no parents, no prior county of residence, no prior county of residence. Sandra spent years working backward from that census entry. She found Celia's children, her grandchildren, her church membership, her burial record. She found letters Celia had written in an elegant hand that suggested some kind of education, a detail that itself became a clue, since literacy among the enslaved was illegal in Maryland until 1864. What she could not find was anything before 1870. The plantation records for the estate she believed Celia had come from were partially held in a county courthouse that had flooded in 1868. The surviving fragments listed enslaved people by first name only. There was a Celia in an 1855 estate inventory listed between 2 names. Sandra did not recognize, valued at $320. That was all. A price, a name, a gap that 11 years of research could not close. Sandra told an interviewer that she had come to understand her ancestors' life not as something lost, but as something deliberately unmade. The system, she said, was not designed to remember her. And then the system broke down, and even the parts that might have accidentally preserved something about her were gone. She paused for a long moment before adding, "But she was here. She raised children who raised children who raised me. That's not nothing. But I want more than that. I think she deserves more than that." There is a legal dimension to this erasure that rarely surfaces in popular conversation, and it matters. When the Civil War ended and Reconstruction began, one of the most contentious questions in American law was the question of inheritance. Could formerly enslaved people make legal claims on the estates of the men who had enslaved them? Men who were, in some documented cases, also their biological fathers? Could they claim wages for labor performed under coercion? Could they assert ownership of land they had worked for generations? The answer, in almost every jurisdiction, was no. And the legal architecture that produced that answer depended, in part, on a documentary silence. If there were no records proving a relationship, there was no relationship the law would recognize. If there were no records of labor, there was no claim for wages. The destruction, or simple absence, of antebellum records was not merely a historical inconvenience. It was a mechanism of dispossession functioning quietly without drama in the paperwork of a country trying to decide how free freedom actually was. This is why the 1870 census carries such weight for so many families. It is not just the first record. It is, in many cases, the first moment the state acknowledged that these people had a past worth documenting. And even then, the acknowledgement was partial, imperfect, administered by an underfunded bureau that would soon be abolished. But here is where the story opens in a direction that complicates easy narratives. The wall at 1870 does not belong only to Black Americans. Irish immigrants who arrived during the famine years of the 1840s and settled in cities where record-keeping was haphazard, or in rural counties where the Catholic Church maintained its own registers that were later lost to fire or flood. They too often find that their American family histories begin in the 1870s or 1880s, the earlier years swallowed by the chaos of arrival and poverty, and a country that was not paying close attention to who exactly was coming off those ships. Indigenous families whose names were anglicized on government rules, sometimes accurately, sometimes randomly, sometimes in acts of small bureaucratic violence, find their genealogies fractured at different points, but with a similar result, a point at which the documentary record becomes someone else's story about who they were, rather than their own. Poor white Southerners, tenant farmers and subsistence homesteaders who moved frequently and interacted rarely with the institutions that generated records find the same wall. Not at 1870 necessarily, but somewhere. A point where the official record simply wasn't interested in them. What this suggests is something larger than the particular history of any one group. It suggests that the American documentary record was always, fundamentally, a record of property and power. It recorded what mattered to the state: land ownership, tax liability, military service, the transfer of assets between men of standing. Everyone else, the vast majority of people who actually lived and worked and built and suffered, existed in the margins of that record, or not at all. The fires and floods that destroyed courthouses and plantation ledgers did not erase a complete history. They erased an already partial one, and the incompleteness was the point. There is something worth sitting with in that recognition. When a family history begins after 1870, it does not mean the family began after 1870. It means the record begins there, and records, as we have seen, are made by people with interests, maintained by institutions with priorities, and destroyed sometimes by forces that are neither accidental nor innocent. The people who came before 1870, whose names we cannot find, whose faces we cannot see, whose voices survive only in fragments if at all. They were here. They built things. They loved people. They made decisions, some of which we are still living with. The absence of their documentation is not evidence of their absence. It is evidence of a system that did not consider their presence worth preserving. And that distinction between absence and erasure is one of the most important distinctions in the study of history, because erasure implies an agent. It implies a choice, even when that choice was made by neglect rather than malice, by indifference rather than conspiracy. The records did not simply vanish. They were unmade, slowly, by a country that had not yet decided, and in some ways has still not decided, whose stories it was responsible for keeping. If you are one of the many people whose family tree ends at a wall, who has found a name in an 1870 census and nothing beyond it, this is not the end of the search. It is, in some ways, the beginning of a different kind of search, one that requires different tools: slave schedules, Freedmen's Bureau records, plantation account books, church registers, oral histories, DNA evidence, the faint impressions left by people who were never meant to leave impressions at all. The records they burned after the fires were not the only records. They were just the ones we expected to find. Somewhere in the gaps, the story continues. It has always continued. The question is whether we are willing to look in the places where they told us nothing would be found.